So welcome all to this presentation this evening for us in the United States, December 24th, for many people, December 25th, the pagan high days. But we're taking this time to study God's Word on a topic that's been of big interest to Davidians for decades, the study of Ezekiel 47. So that's where we're going to investigate some key aspects and ask questions about this and hopefully bring clarity to this and how Davidians look at this, because there are different groups of Davidians and people don't all look at it the same way. So that will be the topic of our discussion today. We're thankful for you that have joined us here today. We will have a PowerPoint presentation that I will go over some high points. We presume a prerequisite knowledge that you're familiar with the rod to some extent. I'm not going to define everything, but we'll use it as a basis to come to how Davidians look at this thing and how they apply it, not only in the past, but presently. And that's something that's of interest to a lot of people. So, of course, before we begin, we want to invite the Holy Spirit to be with us, to guide, lead, and direct us to all truth. So please, as you're able, join with me as we kneel in prayer and invite God's presence to be with us so we can have a clear conception of truth. So let us pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, blessed be thy name. We thank you for the privilege of prayer. We thank you for the opportunity to gather here on this Zoom technology or this Zoom platform. We thank you for the minds that invented this technology, that we can use it for the right reasons to study your word, to pray, and to have these meetings where we can discuss your word and come to a clear understanding of how to apply, especially this vision in Ezekiel 47 that's been an issue of controversy over the decades, but we want to look at it as those of us that are living now. Many people have passed that have brought up these issues. They've passed away now, but we need to understand how to apply it today. So, of course, we can't do that without your presence. So we claim the promise. Where two or three are gathered in your name, you'll be in our midst with the Holy Spirit to guide, lead, and direct us to all truth. Cleanse and purify our hearts and minds that we could be made ready vessels of honor in your sight and become part of that cleansing fountain that will be established during the kingdom to advance the loud cry and bring in the great multitude. So this important study, we're thankful we have this privilege. We ask your blessing upon it, all in the worthy name of Jesus and for his sake. Amen. So, of course, as I'm going to go into a PowerPoint, at any point along the way, if you raise the hand icon, I will finish my sentence or whatever, but certainly call on you if you have a question, comment, or clarification. So don't hesitate. So I will go to a screen share. Now, we have published studies on this. We've done videos on it, but I would say over time, um, our view of it has adjusted somewhat. And it's going to depend on where you come from. If you come from, I would call the trajectory of Salem, Mountain Dale, uh, they hold a high importance to Ezekiel 47. They think it's very significant to uh, their location for their, whatever you want to call it, headquarters or camp or so forth. Other groups, for example, Waco, don't see it that way. And even Bashan, they don't see it as significant as all. So it kind of depends on where you come from. Now, a lot of people are coming into this message that may not be acquainted or associated with groups. So they're going to uh, want to know, well, how do we understand this vision? It's in the Bible. And of course, it's in the shepherd's rod. It's only in one place. That's, of course, Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2. Is the only place it's discussed. It's not in any of the other printed tracts. So we should be able to teach from it and then understand how Davidians have looked at it over time. Okay, starting with Brother Houteff. And I wanted to welcome, before we go here, I'll welcome people. Brother Jobic, welcome from the Philippines. I'll go around the table here. Sister Christine from the great state of Wyoming, welcome. Sister Anna, originally from the Philippines, currently in Thailand. Sister Janelle from Washington State. Cry Aloud Messengers, that's Brother Stanley from South Africa. Brother Peralta, Rob Peralta from California. Brother Ray from the United Kingdom. Sister Lakmali, currently living in Thailand. And Sister Lena from Indonesia. So welcome all. We're glad you have joined us here. I will now go into our PowerPoint. And here's our thumbnail. Ezekiel's river going eastward. Why so confused? Now, depends on where your background as Davidians. Now, many of us have been associated with groups in the past. Myself, I've been associated with Salem for a while, and then Mount Dale, and then, of course, I'm part of UPA 7 now. Other people might have had connections back to Waco, some even Bashan. So depends on your perspective, what you were taught or got exposed to. But the question is, okay, how do we understand this vision? And I got here two different chart or images of Ezekiel 47. And we'll look at those in a little more detail. But here's one of the big questions. We're going to basically address three questions. There is a fountain in there. The question is that fountain open today? Yes or no? That's a huge question. Next question, how did Davidian groups apply this? Is it relevant to the movement of God's storehouse or headquarters or whatever in the past? And how do we apply it today? That's really, in essence, what we're going to look at. Now, like many things, the rod message after the death of Brother Hadaf has been altered and corrupted. So the question is, well, which chart are you going to use? Well, it's best to stick with the original. And in this case, this is the undisputed first edition. It comes from Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2, page 294. It's what you call a rough draft, if you will. Brother Hadaf probably penned this. Okay. But it has all the essential details in it. And we're going to break down some of this. Then the question is, was there ever a colored version? And for a long time, we didn't quite know that. But now, fortunately, as a result of a lot of investigation research, we can state definitively that this is an authorized color edition of this chart that was part of the hunters' charts. Okay, the hunting campaign started in 1953 under Brother Hadaf, and the hunters went out 2 by 2 to fish out Adventists that had been on the mailing list for years. And they all had a set of small charts printed on English linen, the same materials, the large charts. And I'm quite familiar with those charts because of my interactions with Sister Bonnie Smith, Glenn Green, Don Adair, and locating copies in other locations in libraries and so forth. So I know exactly what the originals are. So I knew I had heard in the past that Don Adair had a set of these hunter charts, but I never saw them. And there were reports that he had them, but they got destroyed when they had a fire in Salem back in 2012. So I never was able to get a copy of it. But fortunately, by the grace of God, this man, you probably know the story, Dudley Goff, a former Davidian, came out of the woodwork, so to speak, a few years ago and had an interview on YouTube with Philip Arnold and Douglas Tabor. And he had a bag full of materials he was a hunter under Brother Hadaf. Okay, there's pictures of him with Brother Hadaf. And so he later renounced the message, but in this bag were these original materials, and I was very interested in see that, and I was able to access those and included a set of small charts. And so I was very excited to see these, and so I digitized or scanned them, and in there was this colored version of Ezekiel 47. I was later able to confirm from Trevor Bangham that this was an original, because after Florence Hadaf renounced the message in 1962 and walked away, there were a lot of literature from Old Mount Carmel, original literature and charts. I didn't realize there were charts in there, but that stuff, she walked away from it and it ended up in the hands of M.J. Bingham, Trevor's father. And in it included sets of these small hunter charts. And they still had a copy or two. And so I was able to talk with Trevor and verify indeed it was identical to this, that this was what was issued out to the hunters starting in 1953. So Brother Houteff was alive and well. Now, there's a lot of issues about Sister Bonnie Smith. For those of you who knew her, and I knew her quite well, I spent a lot of time with her, argued that Brother Houteff had some issues with this version. It had been revised a little bit, and he didn't include it in the large charts. There were only 18 large charts. Now, the hunter charts, there were 20 of them, and one of the extra, ones was this one. Now, Sister Bonnie said that there's some things that weren't right with this chart. Okay, and it particular has to do with eastgate. Okay, in this chart, it's open, and the other one, it's closed. Now, I'm not going to go into all those nuances, but those are interesting tidbits that we have from pioneer Davidians that have sadly passed away, but fortunately, we're able to preserve their testimonies in audio form and also all the materials that they have. So we're fortunate to be blessed with that. So we can say that these are the authorized originals, the black and white one, and then from 2SR, and then this colorized version that came out in the hunter chart. So we know that for absolute certainty now. Anything else you see out there that's different colored, it's not original. We'll just say that. Now, how do we look at this? If you go back to the chart, either this one or this one, if you were never a Davidian or you were never connected with any group and you just looked at this vision and then went to Shepherd's Rod Volume 2 and read it, what could you come out of this? What's the basic lesson? Without trying to get into arguing about storehouse and all that. It's important to start here because you get proper context. And the important thing, if you go to Shepherd's Rod Volume 2, is it talks about in Gedai, as it applies to Seventh-day Adventist Church. So all I did is I just removed the one side of the chart and let you focus on this section on the left-hand side. And you see there's the number, 144,000. And then you see under it two references, Zechariah 13, 1 and 2, pointing down to a fountain. And then you see Zechariah 12, verse 8, pointing into that open gate on the north side. So you have this picture here, this diagram with two barriers. Okay, you got a fountain, and then it's sitting on an altar, and then out of it issues a rivulet that goes to the south and then turns and goes east, a teeny rivulet, and that comes to a gate that's open, and then it goes a little farther to the next gate, east gate, which is closed. And that whole thing is called the temple. So to break this down, I always encourage people, go look up what those things mean, according to what the rod says. Now, I'm just going to summarize this, but let's define the terms. Okay. Now, I could go through all of this, but I don't want to take 2 or 3 hours. I assume that you're either familiar with it. If you're not, that's no problem. We can give you a PowerPoint, a PDF version of this, a video, a written document. So if you are not as familiar, that's fine. Let me know. I will give you all of the references to support all of this. We're just summarizing here. So the fountain, of course, is the source of the water, because what comes out of the water, the fountain? Water. To the south, and then it turns and goes east. So we're just going to keep it simple. Then we have water. It's a symbolic vision. So water in Scripture represents two things, truth and people. Okay. And that's fairly straightforward. And this is important because you can't have truth without people or people without truth. They go together. So this shows something that goes and then starts as a teeny rivulet and then progresses eastward. Then we get the altar. That represents a reformation. And of course, the shepherd's rod is all about revival and reformation. And then the temple in the rod calls it the house of David, or a term for God's church. Now, you could apply that to that will be a name for God's church during the kingdom once it's purified. And that's true. However, that kingdom church doesn't come out of nowhere. It's comprised of people. And so that phase is the time we're in now. You think about Ellen White in her first vision. Who did she see? The 144,000 rising up to the holy city on that narrow path. And so the purpose of God raising up Seventh-day Adventist Church was to call the 144,000. Now, here we are, how many years later? It hasn't happened yet, but the vision still stands. God will call the first fruits out of Laodicea, or in this case, in Gedi. So this is important to recognize that this section is applicable to the time of the Seventh-day Adventist Church before Ezekiel 9. And then the eastgate. Now, this is a big term. Salem made big use of this, okay, the east gate. Well, the rod defines it as the threshold of the house. And if you do biblical exegesis, that's the same term that you find in Ezekiel 9. Because that's where the judgment begins, at the house of God, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So it's interesting here. The east gate is obviously there. It's closed. And Sister Bonnie insisted, that's right. Okay, it shouldn't be open. So that's an interesting little topic to think about. And obviously, when the east gate is open, that would be at the time of Ezekiel 9. Because when you get to the second section, okay, I jumped ahead of myself. Within that section to Engedi, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there's actually two sections, if you notice that. And I'll tell you how this came about. I was having a conversation with a sister several years ago, and she asked this question: why is one of those gates open and the other one's closed? And I'm like, that's an interesting question. That's oftentimes what drives us to study, to think about these things and analyze it. I submit that this is the reasonable explanation when we look deeper into this. But the question is when did that fountain open? Now, we're going to look at evidence that it opened in 1844 with Ellen White and the Adventist pioneers. If that's true, then why is this first gate open? Well, what happened in 1930? Here's a reasonable explanation. The first boundary section involved the judgment of the dead, which began in 1844. And that's in complete harmony with everything else in the rod. Okay, the three angels' message, the first proclamation starting in 1831 with William Miller, first angel, second angel, third angel, but it will be repeated with power and force. Of course, that's during the loud cry. So the idea that there's a section involving the judgment dead, and then after 1930, the rod message came and the judgment of the living. That message calling for the sealing of the 144,000 began in 1930. Now, we haven't reached the east gate yet. Once we do, that's, of course, Ezekiel 9. That's a simple way to harmonize. And we came to that because people were asking questions. And it seems to be logical. Does it make sense? Does it fit and harmonize with everything else in the rod? Now, the second section, the rod calls it in eglium. It applies to after the east gate. All of a sudden, what happens to the river or the rivulet? It becomes a great river, and it gets bigger and bigger and deeper and deeper. And in that section, clearly, you see the great multitude, the second fruits coming in. And that's the section during the loud cry. And you can overlap this and harmonize this with everything else in the rod. You know, Revelation 7, first fruits, second fruits. 144,000, great multitude. The stone in Daniel 2, that's cut out of the mountain. That's 144,000. Then what happened? It becomes a great mountain, fills the whole earth. So this parallels and harmonizes with everything else in the rod. So this is important. The reason I'm emphasizing this is if you just look at the study in a basic sense, you can see it's clearly in two sections. And then you can go in and look in more detail about the trees and all of that. But this is important, and you'll see why in a moment. And then ultimately, that river goes out to the sea, which Brother Haddow says is eternity. So that this shows that all the harvest of the souls, the first fruits from Laodicea and the second fruits from the world or Babylon that come out during the loud cry. So this makes perfect sense. There's no conflict at all when we just do. So you could take this study and do a basic chart study with this without getting into all the going eastward and all that. Just do a basic study, level 1. And then you could go into more details, verse by verse, about the marriages and the separate sects. So, I mean, you could go into quite a bit more detail on just a basic level study of this. But as professed Davidians, we have to be careful, or I say beware of one-statement teachers. And you'll see where this is coming from. This comes from Waco ministers. They will say, well, wait a minute, that fountain is not open today. They will insist it, and they will base it on this reference. And this is where we have to be careful not to take one reference and say that, out of context or fail to harmonize with weight of evidence everywhere else in the rod. So here's the key reference. Okay, it's in Time of the Greetings, Volume 1, number 18, page 14. And I personally have had Waco ministers open their Time of the Greetings and show me this verse and ask me to harmonize it. This happened to me back in 2005 when Mount Dale was in the midst of a split. Now, some of us, Sister Christine, you were there. And this happened to me. The Waco ministers were there, and they were proselytizing during that commotion at Mount Dale in 2005 for people to come join them. And this was the lead reference they put in front of me. So you read it. It says, it's quoting Zechariah 13, 1 and 2, and then commenting. It says, in that day, in the day of the great morning, that the great morning takes place, there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. And it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land, and they shall no more be remembered. And also I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land. End of quote. Two things stand out clearly in these verses. This Brother Haddow commenting. One, that the house of David must come into existence before the cleansing fountain is opened. And two, that the cleansing begins with the cutting off the name of the idols and throwing out of the land the false prophets and the unclean spirits. So Waco will jump in. See, the fountain isn't open until the kingdom. Now, if you're new to the rod, that might seem very convincing. However, I emphasize one thing. We got to look at everything the rod says. And in red here, I said, well, that fountain is open for two things, sin and uncleanness, and that when the house of David comes into existence, that's a name for the kingdom church purified, it will come into existence before what? The cleansing fountain. So there's two operations of that fountain, sin and cleansing. And we will see that and ask the question, when did the fountain open? So how do you, your follow-up question is, how do you harmonize with this question? If they're trying to make the argument that the fountain isn't open today, it won't be open till the kingdom, and so therefore going east has nothing to do with the location of your headquarters. That's Waco's argument. But how do you harmonize with this statement? We cannot create conflict within the message. We have to harmonize. So, and Brother Ray, if you see anybody's hand go up, let me know, because I closed the window here so I can read this whole page. So don't hesitate to interrupt if a hand goes up. So this is a statement from Ellen White, 7 Testimonies, page 171, 172. Ellen White is referring to our work has been presented to me as, in its beginning, a very small rivulet. To the prophet Ezekiel was given the representation of waters issuing out from under the threshold of the house eastward and at the south side of the altar. Read Ezekiel 47. especially Mark verse 8. Then said he unto me, these waters issue out toward the east country and go down into the desert and go out into the sea, which being brought forth into the sea, the waters shall be healed. So our work was presented to me as extending to the east and to the west and to the isles of the sea and to all parts of the world. Notice this. Ellen White is talking about her work and the work of the pioneers. She describes it in the beginning as a small, very small rivulet. This is unmistakable. And she's applying it directly from Ezekiel 47. You can't ignore this. You cannot ignore this. You have to harmonize. Okay? So this is crucial. You can't scratch this one out. And I got another reference. I'll read it here in a minute. But this begs the question, well, when are we supposed to overcome sin? I mean, in order to be candidates for the 144,000, we have to be made right. The revival and reformation. So when does that work begin? Well, friends, it's now. And it's clear in this other reference from Ellen White, Testimonies to Ministers, page 450, making once again an allusion to the fountain in Ezekiel 47. It reads, the time has come for earnest and powerful efforts to rid the church of the slime and filth which is tarnishing her purity. The church of Christ is called to be a holy, powerful people, a name and praise to all the earth. There has been opened a fountain for Judah and Jerusalem to wash from all uncleanness and sin. There's an astonishing backsliding with God's people to whom has been entrusted sacred holy truth. Her faith, her service, her works must be compared to what they would have been if her course had been continually onward and upward, according to the grace and holy truth given her. So clearly, in the context of the language, she's applying it to her day. And it's certainly applicable to us now. If we can't overcome sin, then there is no hope for us to make it to the kingdom. So clearly, these two statements from the Spirit of Prophecy, which are out of the Golden Bowl, show that that fountain is open not as a river, but as a teeny rivulet. And the rod gives us context, of course. Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2. Sin first, then uncleanness. Page 291. The church in her purity is called by these scriptures. Zechariah 12, verse 8, and Revelation 7, verse 9, the house of David. So that is one of the terms for the church purified. No question. We agree that that cleansing fountain will be opened once the house of David is set up, after it's set up. So we agree completely with 1TG number 18. We don't disagree with it, but we have to harmonize with everything else. Brother Houteff continues, therefore, this term becomes one of the names of the church in the time of the loud cry. In that day there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. Zechariah 13:1. Note that this fountain is able to wash away two things. First, sin, and second, uncleanness. What is the difference between the one and the other? Sin is the transgression of the law, 1 John 3:4. And the result of sin is the decay of the body. God is able to heal the soul and the body, but he will not heal the latter before he has healed the former. Sin first, then uncleanness. Praise the Lord for the shepherd's rod. So the work of overcoming sin is now. Now. And then the uncleanness is once we get to the kingdom, we'll be given what? A new heart. Jeremiah 31. The heart of stone will be given a heart of flesh, and God will write his law on it once and for all. So we clearly see that that fountain is open first for sin and then for uncleanness. One part before Ezekiel 9, one part after. This is essential for our soul salvation. We cannot chop off and say, oh, the fountain's only open in the kingdom. Then we would deny this very work of the need to overcome sin, the very prerequisites to enter the kingdom. So that covers why it's so important to answer that first key question. Is the fountain open today? And the answer is absolutely. As a teeny rivulet. Always add those qualifiers, definitions, okay? It's referring to the time starting with Ellen White, continuing all the way up until Ezekiel 9. Now we're going to go into the section about some probing questions that need to be answered regarding applying this to our history. So, does the flow of Ezekiel River say anything about the movement of God's storehouse from its rise in Southern California in 1930? Now, I will post the answer to this at the end, but for now, ponder it. We're going to look at the evidence. What happened to God's storehouse after the death of Brother Houteff in 1955? This is the million-dollar question. I mean, Davidians have wrestled and struggled with this for decades, before many of us were even born. This has been a hot issue of controversy, and it's still with us. So we have to, there are even Davidians that don't even believe there's a storehouse today, which is remarkable. There has to be, because the storehouse is where the meat comes from. And without the meat, we have no truth, present truth. So there should be an answer to this. And then what criteria can we safely and assuredly use to identify God's storehouse and how it's moved during the period from 1955 up to the present day? This is where we have to trace it through history. And this is crucial. We have to know who we are and where we came from. And so this is a part that's been what you call a chapter of history that's been muddied up considerably because of all the different voices that have arisen after the death of Brother Houteff, all the different factions. Everybody has a different story. And then how can we account for the multitude of unauthorized Davidian association or groups that have risen since 1955? Now, God certainly has those that he's recognized or authorized, but there's certainly counterfeits along the way. So how do you decide who's right and who's wrong? I mean, these are big questions. But we can look for answers. So what about this whole idea of headquarters moving eastward? So let's answer that question. Was it ever used to as an argument for moving the publishing work and eastward? And the answer is yes. And here it is in the history of the Old Shepherds or Old Mount Carmel Symbolic Code, Volume 1, Number 10, page 3. This is published in 1934. It has been evident for some time that it would soon be necessary to seek a more central location for the office in order to serve the whole field efficiently. So those at headquarters have been praying very earnestly over this matter for many months, and as they kept on praying for light, the Lord finally indicated definitely that beautiful Southern California was no longer to remain the center of his work for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But an eastward course was to be seen in the stream from that fountain, which is to swell into the great river of Ezekiel's prophecy. And plans were formulated whereby a thorough search could be made in the territory indicated by the Lord where the future headquarters were to be found. So this is irrefutable, that on the basis of the eastward direction of that little rivulet headed towards the great river at Ezekiel 47, they moved the storehouse at the time in Los Angeles, and eventually they relocated to Waco, Texas. In 1934, they didn't know yet. They just started searching out. And of course, the Symbolic Code has the rest of that story, how the Lord directed them to the property at the time that was outside the city limits of Waco, Texas. So this is irrefutable proof that that fountain had to be open in 1934. Now, years ago, this question about where's God's storehouse today, we did a investigation on it, and or a series of presentations. I was transfixed trying to figure out where the storehouse went after Brother Houteff died. So this period from 1955, at the time I was doing this was 2010. And the question arose from brethren that were actually in Canada, British Columbia. There were 3 families studying there, and they really wanted to know the answer to this. So I was dialoguing with one of them, a young man in particular, a new Davidian, and the 2 families had been formerly associated with Bashan for a while. They got they weren't convinced of things. They studied with Waco for a while, but they were floating around. And so this young man wanted to come visit me. At the time, I was living in Connecticut, and he was going to drive all the way across Canada and down to the US. And I said, well, wait a minute. Maybe it'd make more sense if I flew out there and met with you all. And I did. And this was in right after the Vancouver Olympics in British Columbia, Vancouver, British Columbia, the Winter Olympics. So I went out there and I spent several days there, and I debuted this study on the history of God's storehouse from Genesis to Revelation. Now, I was transfixed on trying to figure out where the storehouse went after Brother Hadaf died. My wife came in and said, wait a minute, nobody will understand you. You got too much detail. You got to go back and start in Genesis. And I'm like, I argued with my wife and argued and argued. She said, they'll never figure it out. You got to show the history from all the way back. And so after about 2 weeks, I couldn't convince my wife, and the Lord was convinced or talking to me and saying, well, maybe you ought to listen to your wife. So I did, and I thought about it. I said, oh, it's too much. There's so much to cover. I can't do it in one presentation. My wife said, well, break it up. So what we ended up doing is 6-part study, starting way back in the Old Testament, moving into the New Testament era, the Reformation era, the ninth hour message, starting with the Millerites and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, up to Shepherd's Rod, starting with Brother Hadaf, up to 1955. So all of that was fairly straightforward. But the rod had a lot of insight in it. And then we get to this section 4 about what I call the Davidian knockout blow, or the devil's attempt to deliver a knockout blow. White House Recruiter 33. Of course, he wasn't successful. A lot of people got knocked out, but not everybody. So why do I call it a blessing in disguise? Here's why. Well, one thing is a lot of Davidians will come in and they're discouraged when they find out all these factions and nobody agrees. I'm like, well, it's actually prophesied. Do you realize that God prophesied that this thing, we're going to be all scattered? And there's a reason behind this, that if you look at it, it's really a blessing rather than, oh, it's so discouraging because we have all these factions. So here's the verse, Zechariah 13, verse 7. And Davidians, after the death of Brother Hadaf, recognized this. They said, a Waco's sword against my shepherd and against the man that is my fellow, with, saith the Lord of hosts, smite the shepherd and the sheep shall be scattered. Now, of course, the primary application of that, of course, is the death of Christ and the scattering of the early Christian church around the world. But Davidians also saw that this applied to the death of Brother Hadaf as the under-shepherd and a typical David, Joshua, Zerubbabel, and so forth, that this is exactly what happened to the shepherd's rod message. After the death, and I'll show a diagram to show this in great detail, but this is exactly what's happened. So it shouldn't be a shock to us to look at the people that profess to follow the shepherd's rod to see it all scattered. And the question becomes, well, is maybe there a reason behind this, or a design, or a purpose? I submit there is. So we did this study, and this is a pivotal piece of history, the 61 session. And Davidians, they call themselves 100% rod-only Davidians. And they reorganized in California to oppose the apostate Florence Hadaf-led association. Now, Florence Hadaf, as most of us know, the day after Brother Hadaf died, literally usurped and took over the association and removed the office of president and installed herself by popular vote as vice president. Okay, this is all recorded history. And it's interesting, a lot of Davidians still follow that leadership model. They vote and nominate for a vice president and executive council, so they're following Florence Hadaf. But the other thing that she did that was dramatic, and most of us that are here are wide awake, is she corrupted the message. And one of the biggest ones was the unauthorized symbolic codes. She continued to publish symbolic codes. They looked just like the original, volume 10, number 1 and 2, the covers were the same, but in those came in some outright heresy about predicting a 42-month ending in April of 59. We all know that's false. So fortunately, more and more Davidians are waking up to this. And I think everybody here on this platform today has realized, now many of us believe those things, especially if you came from Salem or Mountaindale. They're thoroughly entrenched in them, or Waco and Bashan. But there are more and more Davidians realizing that those were unauthorized. They contain a lot of history that's interesting and useful, but they contain some doctrinal areas that are clearly dangerous. And that's been thoroughly rooted out and documented. So we thank God for that. But another thing she did, a lot of people aren't as aware, is she changed their literature as well. She came up with the 11th hour radio messages. She did that with Dudley Goff, the 11th hour radio. They took the message to the radio waves, rented time on radio stations, ABC, and took the message to the Protestants. I'm like, there's nothing like that in the rod. This is after the 1959 debacle, predicting Ezekiel 9. It didn't happen. So she really corrupted the message big time. She added the codes, unauthorized new codes, and the literature. So the reason these Davidians organized was to reestablish two things. One, to publish the original literature, because they knew what it was, and two, to train Bible workers. That was their mandate. And this is all recorded. We have all the documents on the session codes. Anybody wants to look into this, we freely make it available. In this picture, it's interesting. There are four figures that would later become prominent. So just show you, because they're all united here in 1961, didn't mean they would be that way forever. You have over on the far left, you've got M.J. Bingham and his second wife, Genevieve, not Genevieve, that was his lawful first wife, but the second wife, who he married after he shouldn't have married. He was in adultery. He married after Brother Haddoff died. That was Trevor's mother. They later became heads of Bashan. You have Brother Warden in the back there, who kept alive the message in the 60s and 70s. And up in the front, that young man in the white shirt with his hand around the other guy, that's the young Donnie Wayne Adair, who later started Salem, or took over Salem. He didn't start it, he took it over. So you've got four people here that became instrumental in different factions over time that were all once united. So this is interesting. Now, some of these other people, Sister Bonnie knew most of these people. Unfortunately, I don't know all of them. And I think everybody in this picture has passed away now. Don Adair passed away last summer. But this is part of our history. But there was a purpose. And fortunately, there's written records of what happened here. Out of this, we piece together what we call a lineage of the true and faithful. That is, who preserved the original rod message. That is the key criteria. So this is just a summary. So the rod started in 1930. In 1934, it was in Los Angeles, California. It moved eastward to Waco, Texas, on the basis of Ezekiel 47, and existed there till 1962. Now, Brother Haddoff died in 55. Florence took over, but they continued to publish and have original literature. It wasn't until 62. God basically gave Florence 7 years, and she took the message down, down, down. By 62, she resigned and renounced the whole message. And the literature that was left, the 2.5 tons on the pallets, ended up with M.J. Bingham. So God, just at the right time, rose up those 100% rod-only Davidians the year before to reorganize and get back to the original message. So from 61 to 70, Davidians existed in Vista, that's Southern California, and they continue to print the original rod literature. And we have copies of this. It's all documented. They moved to Salem in 1970. And why Salem? Well, Salem had a rest home there that had been built in 1946, and Brother Haddoff visited the place in 1948. And there were testimony that he said this place would be important in the future of God's work. Nobody knew exactly what that meant, but it existed as a place that published the original Shepherd's Rod for a period of 4 years, from 70 to 74. Then there was a split. A lot of Davidians were supporting Salem, but they lived out in California, and they disagreed with Don Adair because Don Adair took over in 1973. He used basically a coup d'etat, and get himself voted in.
Brother Eric?
Yes, Brother Rob.
I'm sorry. I tried to push my hand up, but for some reason it went up and then it came right back down.
No problem. No problem.
I wanted you to give your thoughts about something before we go much further. Yes, it's true that they had the original message and redid it and was proclaiming it with the 1961 formation of the 100% Rod group. Now, why is it that you think, give me your thoughts on why that group, pretty much because we know from the symbolic newsletters they sent out and different things and their reports on their sessions that they supported the new codes. What do you think the reason is for that?
Oh, that's a great question because that argument has thrown up by people, advocates that continue to support the new codes. That well, see, they used the new codes. What's interesting, if you look at it, if you go to say Brother Harry Warden, who was a ordained minister under Brother Houteff, who really was the man that kept this organized together during that period of time, I have several letters from him. And I never saw him using the new codes to justify teachings that later came from Salem, i.e., Assyrian Confederacy, or issues about Jacob's time of trouble. It was never really discussed. Okay? So the question is, well, why did it come out later that people saw problems in those codes? I can only attribute that, Brother Peralta, to God's providence. That started around the late 90s. Up until that point, Davidians, more or less, I mean, they trusted Florence Houteff, Brother Houteff's wife. She was very high IQ, photographic memory, expert stenographer. It was by assumption that, she's faithful. Well, over time, she proved herself to be one of those ones that Brother Houteff warned about, office seeker, usurper. And thank God we have criteria. By their fruit you know them, just like the Bible gives us tests. How do you know? By what? To the law and the testimony. They speak not according to this, there's no light in them. By their fruit you will know them. The spirit of prophets speaking unto all the prophets. So we have these scripture tests to decide who's a true prophet versus a false. So you apply it to Florence Houteff. Clearly she fails. Okay, false. But I don't think Davidians recognize the problems in those new codes because they weren't amplified or made a big deal of it. That didn't happen until Salem in 1974. Don Adair, through Salem's symbolic codes, I call them unauthorized because the only authorized codes published by the prophet while I lived ended at volume 10, number 2, October 1954. That's it. Any code after that is unauthorized. And in those codes came corrupted doctrines. So it was no different. Don Adair started publishing symbolic codes out of Salem. He took over in 73. So 74, he used those codes to begin to introduce doctrines that people went, whoa, wait a minute. And guess what one of them was? Eastgate. That's where that big deal about, because he wanted to use it to justify Salem. So that came out of the codes. He then later, Don Adair, now I studied with him for 9 months. I have detailed handwritten notes of everything he studied, if anybody ever wants to see it. But Don Adair made a big deal about teachings out of the new codes about the Syrian Confederacy, Jonah phase of the message, Jacob's time of trouble being before Ezekiel 9. All of that really got amplified by Don Adair, starting in the 70s and 80s. And it was co-opted by the brethren that were later separated out of Salem in 1983, which became later Mountaindale. So we inherited, those people that came from the Salem Mountaindale trajectory, inherited those teachings of the new code that were principally made up by Don Adair. So Warden didn't talk, you didn't see Davidians talking about any of that stuff in the 60s, zero. It only came in later in the late 70s and 80s, and Don Adair and his website, I think it's still up, but those studies where he really makes a big deal about going east and Jacob's time of trouble, and especially the Syrian Confederacy, he wrote a whole book on it. Okay? Follow the Protestant nations. So those of us that were in contact with that were heavily influenced by that. I mean, pretty much programmed by it. I mean, I myself am one. I think later in the late 90s, there were Davidians that began to say, wait a minute, they're a problem. And I'll give credit to the ones I know of because I've talked to two of them personally. One was a man named John Adair who used to study with Salem. And then later, Don Adair talked to him, oh, well, there's some Davidians that don't believe the new codes. He would say this. Well, who's that, Brother Don? Oh, well, there's this Brother O'Raw. He lives in Virginia now. He doesn't believe in the trumpets. We're in the sixth trumpet. Or and and I'm like, oh, so I remember at the time I'm a new Davidian. I've been studying the message, 9 months, a year. Oh, okay. But it stuck in my head. I later met this man, and spent a whole day talking with him. And all he did is said, well, wait a minute. Track number 5 says this, and these new codes say that. There's a problem here. John Adair put together a little study in a track. And at the Waco session in the year 2000, I was there. Brand new Davidian. I've been studying the message for 2 weeks. I attended that session on a Sabbath, and there was all kinds of commotion. I won't go into details here, but this man and his wife were there, and they were passing out this little pink track called "Which Has a Sixth Trumpet Sounded Yet?" Question mark. I took a copy. I never read it. Later, it was calling into question about the new code. So that's the year 2000. I found out later there was brethren in Florida that had been part of Waco, Bobby Dice, Burke McLean, and some people might know those names. They began to recognize problems as well. What happens? 2 years later, Waco 2002, Michael Graham and Lennox Sam, I think, got that pink track and say, well, there's a problem with this one. What about others? And they presented a formal study before the Waco session 2002 to challenge, hey, there's a problem with several 5 main doctrines. So I think it's the providence of God. And then other people, and then we came into it in 2008 when we opened UPA 7. I was puzzled. I said, I can't figure out where these new codes come from. I couldn't find the original source. And I got the DVD from Lennox Sam, and I watched it, and I'm like, oh, now I see what's going on. So I think, Brother Peralta, that it was God's providence. It didn't come from one person, but from different sources. And over time, now we can look back and say, God said, now it's time to winnow out and get rid of this. Let's get back to the pure message.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Now, one thing we will make note of, and a lot of people don't know this, that transpired while Don Adair was alive. Sister Eva had a conversation with Brother Adair. I think it was a year or two before he died, and she failed to say it was recorded. She really regrets that she didn't tell him that, but she did have it recorded, and she had it that she asked Brother Adair, "Where did you get the Assyrian Confederacy teaching from?" And Don Adair said, "Well, that's my teaching." So he admitted that he made that doctrine from his own studies. And so it's very important to know that that is pretty much how the Assyrian Confederacy, as we know it, as many Davidians today know it, came from. Not from the message, more or less, but from his studies and his construction, making the Assyrian Confederacy into a doctrine, So it's very telling.
Brother Peralta, that's correct. I can believe that 100%. He cooked it up. It was, you look in all the prior documentation, and I have a cabinet full of it, correspondence between Davidians. That term never existed. Okay.
Right.
So he made it a peculiar doctrine to justify, because his obsession, Salem's the place. I mean, he was obsessed with it. He had other pet doctrines that he made a big issue out of. Those with is another one. I'm not going to, you all are familiar with that. But and I study with him. I mean, and people that have been studied with him, I realized it, awakened up and realized that, he added a whole lot to the message. Another cardinal one is the charts. In particular, the one with the golden bowl, how many tubes are pulling oil out. Okay. I remember him saying it. And when that came to our attention, let me find that one here. Yeah. Okay. There's the bowl. This is the original chart. Only 6 of the 7 tubes from the candlestick are going over and taking oil out. So that whole controversy, I never knew it before, but Don Adair freely admitted that he added the 7th one. So those images of the temple chart from Mount Dale and Waco are all corrupted. And people, I remember him saying it, but people would call him, many people, and he freely admitted it. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that and this is a lesson for us, is we cannot lean on the arm of flesh. We have to thoroughly vet and confirm.
Study for ourselves. Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
when he went into this Assyrian Confederacy, he was the the one of the main promoters of these new codes. And that's where he gets a lot of these ideas from, you know.
Yes,
And so you put two and two together, and Ellen White, and I tell this to the brethren all the time. Ellen White made a profound statement in Counsel to Writers and Editors, page 37, and you know this very well. We have many lessons to learn, and notice she doubles down, many to unlearn, right? So Don Adair is a perfect example for us Davidians today, is that we've got to unlearn a lot of the doctrines that we have been taught simply because they're not based on the golden bowl, which you just shown. They're based on Don Adair and his constructions. I'm sad to say.
absolutely. And I think that for us, I just encourage people, this God has allows this as a test to prove us that because we know you can't stand leaning on anybody's arm, including your spouse or your best friend or whatever. We're going to stand alone before the judgment car. So it's an individual accountability. So we got to get down to the bottom of all of these issues. And so over time, I encourage people to really take the time, because you'll be blessed. You'll come out of with a much better understanding. You'll know what the truth is. You'll know you're on the rock, even if it takes time. I mean, there's been doctrines I've spent months waving through it, just to make sure that you're on the platform of the original. So the same thing with Ezekiel 47. Step back, wipe the slate clean, start with a blank piece of paper and just look at the charts and say, what do I see here? And how do I harmonize with what else is in the rod? Just break it down simple, step by step. And you clearly see, like I said, that's why I started with the 2 sections. One for the period of Ezekiel 9, one for after. I mean, it harmonizes everything. So, and don't read into it anything that's not there. So yeah, this is good lessons for us. Now, let me go back. So this split with Salem in 74 is key. This is absolutely essential because this is written. I have all the documents, but there was disagreement because Don Adair was teaching things, introducing doctrines in the Salem codes that the brethren back in California were going, wait a minute. And this did result in a split. And this, you see these things happen over and over. And so one of the things that he taught that there was disagreement over was the concept of Eastgate, the headquarters must be on the East Coast. That was one of them, amongst others. So as a result of that, at least 12 people signed off on a letter opposing Salem and Don Adair, who had taken over. And once he took over in 73 as vice president, he remained there till his death, which was last summer. So it was a total power, he wasn't going to let anybody else get in there. Okay. And that led to later why the brethren ended up in Mount Dale. There was a power struggle. And so Don Adair maintained total control of that place until his death. Now, 74, Davidian brethren. Now, I say a lot of these Davidians was Bonnie Smith and Sidney Smith were central this one. Now, they'd been kind of out of the picture in the 70s or in the 60s, but they came back with Ukaipa and other Davidians, Glenn Green, and they reorganized. And once again, back to the original mandate, 61, publish the original literature and train Bible workers. And I keep saying this, this is the bottom line. This is all we need, okay, in its essence. This is the foundation. So they kept that alive until 86. Now, what happened in 86? Well, there was a group that Don Adair was very active in the Caribbean islands. And there was a big group in different islands, but in particular Jamaica. And there were converts in there. And of those are a couple of the notable ones with Anthony Hibbert and Norman Archer and others. And they later became instrumental in forming Mountaindale and then Archer with Waco. Uh, but those Caribbean islanders, okay, there was a issue. Waco had session, or I'm sorry, Salem had sessions back then. I have copies of it. And Don Adair would be voted, nominated vice president, and so forth. But there was discussion in the session in 83 that the people really liked Anthony Hibbert. He was a paid Bible worker under Don Adair, and he worked out in New York, and he was very successful. God blessed him. And there was a large group there, at least 50 brethren. Okay, so sizable group. And they were talking, well, hey, Brother Hibbert should maybe be nominated next vice president. Don Adair would have nothing of it. And if you want to know the origin of the those with doctrine, this is what it is. And I'm not going to go into details here, but I've got it all documented. Don Adair needed a way to get rid of Hibbert and disqualify him. And that was the issue. He called out Hibbert in a public meeting and said, where do you stand on the those with? And Brother Hibbert said, well, I believe there's only 144,000 saved alive. And Adair said, sit down, you're teaching error. And then he introduced the study on the those with. So he used it as a weapon to remove Anthony Hibbert from consideration as vice president. The brethren were outraged with this, and they were all cast out. Don Adair disfellowshipped them because they showed up in Salem, demanded a special session, and Don said, you disobeyed orders from headquarters. You're formally no longer card-holding members. So they used the fellowship card, and I have verbal testimonies from people. I interviewed several people that were part of that. So they were back in New York in 83. They were in a basement. Brother Hibbert had nowhere to live. He was cut off from his source of income. They were praying and fasting. He said, Lord, help us. And so God helped them find a location, an old Jewish camp in Mountaindale. But one thing they lacked was they didn't have a way to literature. They had 2 sets of charts. That was it. And one of them discovered these older Davidians back in Yucaipa. And they sent a congregation of 3, and they went out there and met them. And they got together, and they merged in 86. So the Davidians from Yucaipa merged with Mountaindale in 86. And Yucaipa had the printing press, and they moved that printing press to Mountaindale. So from 86 up until about 2005, Mountaindale continued to print original literature. Now, why 2005? This is significant because 2005, Mountaindale had a humongous issue, a split. I'm not going to go into details of that. I was an eyewitness, and Sister Christine was as well. It was quite a show. I could do a whole study on that alone. But I'm just going to trace these storehouses as we can establish who kept alive the original literature. So it started in Southern California, moved to Waco, and existed from 1935 to 62. But God raised up faithful Davidians in 61. They reorganized back in California. Now, the whole story about why they ended up back in California is interesting. That's published. It was it's amazing, but it was in the Symbolic Code 61. Bingham, because most of them were in favor of, let's go back to Waco, because that seemed to be the place. But God intervened, and Bingham gave the study, says, oh, we're no longer in Carmel pasture, we're now in Bashan. So that was enough to convince them that it was okay to reorganize back in California. Now, later we come to find out that whole doctrine, Bingham used it as a basis to say we're no longer in Carmel pasture. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not true. There's a difference between Mount Carmel Center and Carmel pasture. They're 2 different things. We know that now. But that was the argument that was used that convinced them to not go back to Waco. If God wanted them really be back in Waco, they should have been back there in 61. But they didn't. They ended up back in California. And then they moved to Salem in 1970. There was a split, and they reorganized back in Yucaipa, and then Yucaipa merged with Mountaindale. And 1986. So this is just showing this back and forth. I don't attribute any significance other than this is just the actual where the publishing work, or some people called it headquarters or camp, bounced back and forth across the U.S. And then I only put this, I'm not making an argument in the context of Ezekiel 47. You'll find out why. But I just point, UPA 7 started in Connecticut. Okay. That just happened to be where we were. Now, I am not going to make an argument that this is a justification based on going east. And you'll see why in a minute. Now, I just bring this up, and this is a quote I got from Brother Peralta on Facebook, just to show you that how we look at our history is important because there are some differences here. I'm just outlining here. So you're making an appeal that God has always had one main organization, or I say one place where he's preserved the truth, or storehouse. Yeah, we call it a storehouse. So following eastward course, okay, you outlined Los Angeles, it started there, okay, goes to Waco, number 2, but then you jump to Florence. Now, we think Florence is still part of Old Mount Carmel because the original literature stayed with her, even though she was corrupting things, until she walked away in 62, renounced everything. But God had the 100% rod only rose up. So we include Florence as part of Old Mount Carmel, even though Brother Houteff had died. Now, the 100% rod only reorganized in 61 and then moved to Salem and Brother Proto, that's South Carolina. I know you haven't been there, but they moved to Salem, and that existed. Now, you push Salem all the way up until 83. We have to say that the Yucaipa split is significant. There are people that are still alive that were part of that. And the dispute was, like I say, over teachings that Adair brought into the new codes, or brought into Salem codes, based on the unauthorized new codes published by Florence. That was a big part of it. And so the move back to Yucaipa is significant. You got to add that one in. And then, of course, Mountaindale, 83. Now, you go all the way to the present. We'll stop at 2005, and I'll give you the reasons why we say that. And so this is our argument, why God moved the storehouse from Mountaindale. Now, the history is that God moves the storehouse. You can trace it, and there are reasons why. I mean, the big one is from the widow of two mites gave her tithes to the treasury, the Sanhedrin, if you will, the synagogue, and Jesus didn't rebuke her. That was still the storehouse. It moved in the book of Acts after they stoned Stephen, then the storehouse in the early Christian church. So God moves the storehouse for a reason at times, and it's no different today. So our experience is when my wife and I were in the Philippines from 2003 to 2006, we were under Mountaindale most of that time. And we brought literature, but that literature depleted quickly. And so with the group we were studying with, we needed lots more literature. And so I recognized that we needed more publishing houses based on a statement I'll share in 7 testimony here in a minute. So I approached Mountaindale and said, can we set up a publishing here in the Philippines? And their answer was, the executive council says no. That was it. They just don't believe in it. So I attempted later to meet with the vice president after the 2005 split. They had a session in 2006. I went back there, and he jumped in the car and drove off to the zoo. I mean, I was basically just ignored. And I'm like, Lord, I came there for the specific purpose. We need literature in the Philippines. What can we do about it? And Mountaindale was just not interested. That's what happened. So in that period, 2005, 2006, Mountaindale also was no longer printing original rod track literature. They began in 2005. My wife was involved with this when she was in their DLI. They began to retypeset because the old printing plates were wearing out. And the cover artwork began to get changed or revised. They colorized it, and they brought in the Photoshop stuff. So by 2005, no longer original. What we're talking about is photographic reproduction. So that's another fact. So Later, we discovered that this problem in the Philippines was not just centralized there, it was worldwide. And I found this out when I went to Africa in 2018, is Mount Dale groups in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Mount Dale would come over once a year, entertain the flock, take all their tithe, and go back to the U.S. and fail to feed them with complete. When I was there, I asked brethren, like in Zimbabwe, there's like 30 brethren. Some had been in the message for 20 years. I said, do you show me your literature? Does anybody have a complete set of literature? And I pulled out of my bag. I said, do you have all of this? And nobody said yes. They had like a few pieces here and there. At best, somebody might have, 20 or 30 pieces. And I'm like, okay, we're going to solve this problem. The same thing in the South Pacific in Vanuatu. And I said, okay, that's why we're here. We're going to help you set up publishing, and then you can print everybody 75 pieces of tract litter. That's the first order business. So this was another what I call glaring deficiency, failing to feed the flock. Okay, this is criminal. And I'm like, okay, and so I saw it with my own eyes. I couldn't deny it. So this whole question about UPA 7, we started in Connecticut in 2006. Now, it's a geographic fact that Connecticut is 2 hours east of Mount Dale. That's just what it is. Does that have anything to do with Ezekiel 47? The answer is no. And I'll show you why. But here's some interesting history about why Hartford. This is something that I've known for a long time, but it's just what you keep. Providential circumstances. Hartford is a small city, but a suburb of Hartford is a place called Rocky Hill. There's an Adventist church there. I know, I've been there. I've been thrown out of that church. I've been to every Adventist church in Connecticut back when I lived there from 2000. I lived there, my wife and I, for 7 years before we relocated to Tennessee. I want you to think about that. If you study Adventist history, Rocky Hill's an important place. And so there's Hartford, there's Rocky Hill, and then Middletown, Connecticut. Those places are significant in terms of the origin of the publishing work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. If you know your Seventh-day Adventist history, and I submit as Davidians, we should really read some of the key books like Lothborough's book, Rise of the Great Advent Movement, to understand our history, who we are as a people. But the publishing work started right here in Rocky Hill. Now, there's a whole story. You can read it in the E.G. White Spiritual Gifts and the biography of her, The Rising of the East, and concluding there. So while living, this is Ellen White and her husband, with the Belden family in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, that's a historical site. You can still visit it. Adventist Heritage Site. Ellen White received a vision telling her husband to stop working in the fields and start the publishing work. Okay, in the summer of 1849, James White began publication of The Present Truth, an 8-page semi-monthly paper. Now, they had no money, but God impressed her, just get it done. They did it on a loan. And James White walked back and forth from Rocky Hill to Middletown, Connecticut. That's where the print shop was, with the galley proofs, back and forth, 8 miles one way. Okay. And that first edition went out to the scattered flock, and that began to unite the Advent movement. And the brethren began to send in donations to support it, and God blessed that. So that was the beginning of the Adventist publishing work, Rocky Hill, Connecticut. Interesting coincidence. So here we are all these years later. After the Mount Dale split in 2005, 2006, the work to restore the original literature began in Hartford. This day, 18 years ago, December 24th, that's when I started this. So August 2008, 2 years later, we did this work in quiet. Nobody knew about it. Davidians were in turmoil. They were trying to reorganize the work in the East. And there was all kinds of stuff going on. My wife said, just leave it alone. Just get to the work and get it done. And so 2008, we announced the website, UPA 7, announcing a simple means to establish publishing houses worldwide. And when we did that, oh man, it flipped the Davidian world upside down. I mean, our phones, we had a landline, a cell phone, rang off the hook nonstop for 2 days. Who are you? Where is this? Wow, this is great. Or, you know, people suspicious. They were trying to figure out how many people work with you. I mean, it was just like nobody could figure out. It just came out of the blue. So this concept, it intrigued people. It was unprecedented. Nobody had ever thought of such a thing because the thinking before that, oh, we got to have a headquarters in the publishing work, the old conventional offset printing press, that the one place can supply the world literature for the entire world. That was the thinking. Now, back in Brother Haddough's day, that was the only available technology. But 2008, things are different. We have digital technology. And then 2012, we relocate to Eastern Tennessee. And then 2018, finally, Brethren in Africa started messaging me. Brother Stanley was one of the first. We sent him a DVD with all the print files, everything. And people are trying to, we need this literature really bad. And we start getting these calls from Africa, from Vanuatu. And I didn't want to travel, believe me. But the Lord worked it out. And that's where those trips, and we set up, those were the first two publishing houses, first in Zimbabwe and then Vanuatu. And then later, now, Brother Stanley and other brethren there are instrumental setting up publishing houses in other African countries. So this is how it started. It took 10 years before this thing took off. But we believe the vision, without a vision, the people perish. So how do we deal with the whole idea of the publishing work? We call it completing the circuit, and you'll see where I get this idea from. In Revelation 7:2, it says, I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. Now, Don Adair would use this statement, this verse, and Ellen White's statement that it's true that the publishing work and the rise of the three angels' message occurred in New England. It started in Connecticut. The publishing went from there up to Paris, Maine, and then from there to Rochester, New York, and then eventually to Battle Creek. So you saw that publishing headquarters, Review and Herald, moving around. It started back there where in the East. And then Ellen White, years later, passed away in California, 1915. And then this statement, Don Adair used this one, and I'll show you how in the next thing. So the Shepherd's Rod track, page 10, it said, finally, in 1929, through the Sabbath school lessons, the Lord announced throughout the Seventh-day Adventist denomination that the angel had arrived, the angel that rose from the east. So the message had gone quiet from 1915, but in 1929, God rose up his prophet, interpreted prophet Brother Haddow through the Sabbath school quarterly, the later lessons on the book of Isaiah, and the rod began in the West. And the original rod message got reestablished back in the very place it began. So the circuit completed. Now, where did this idea come from? Well, Don Adair created a lot of diagrams, and this illustration, which I call partial truth, he used this argument. And I think the part about starting in Portland, Maine, actually started in Rocky Hill, Connecticut. It went to Portland, Maine. The publishing Review and Herald started up in Maine. Ends up in California. Ellen White dies. The message goes quiet, but then the Shepherd's Rod comes up, and then Adair takes it. Okay, it moves from Los Angeles to Waco in 1935. Absolute fact. It moves from, now he skips, of course, Vista. All right. He leaves it out. So what he wants to do is justify Salem. So he goes from Waco to Salem in 1970, literature reprinted. Now that's true. They reprinted original literature in Salem in 1970, but Don Adair wasn't part of Salem. He didn't come in until 1973. And when he took over, eventually, Salem no longer printed the original tracts. They came up with the big books, the compilations. Okay. So Salem quit printing original tract literature in the mid-1970s, late 70s. By then, God moved that storehouse back to Yucaipa. But this idea, okay, Salem he uses the same thing, Shepherd's Rod Pocket Edition, page 10, but he stops at Salem. Okay, and then he uses Ezekiel 47, saying, well, we got three headquarters, 1930 in Los Angeles, 1935 Waco, 1970 Salem, and then that's the end of the story. And years ago, I said, well, wait a minute, that's incomplete. He's not telling the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. One of his favorite statements, Testimonies, Volume 1, page 415, he said, according to the light which God has given me, there will yet be a large company raised up in the East to consistently obey the truth. Now, Don Adair made this argument. I remember walking in the woods and he told me this. He said, out here, because the place that they had 8 acres out there, it wasn't actually in Salem. It was in a town called Tomasi, 6 miles west of Salem. A lot of people don't know that unless you've been there. I lived in Salem proper, and I would travel to study with Don Adair 3 days a week for about 9 months. So I know the layout of the territory. I lived there for 3 years. But he said next to that was the National Forest. And he said this large chunk of land, he said, you know, the 144,000 are going to be gathered all out here. And God put us right here because this is where the solemn assembly is going to take place. That's what he used to teach. And at the time, I didn't know. Okay. You think about it, it's like, we're talking primitive woods. I'm like, how are you going to set up a place for 144,000 people to live out where there's no infrastructure, no septic tanks, no water? I mean, you'd have to, but that's what he used to teach people that were part of Salem. And that was what was pounded into the head. It's all because of Ezekiel River. So Don Adair's the one that took this moving east as the big deal. He's the one that amplified it. And these are diagrams to show that. Now, our position on this is, of course, the group that got cast out of Salem and formed Mountaindale used the same argument because Mountaindale is even further east than Salem. So they hang on to the same argument from Don Adair. Oh, we got to have a headquarters in the east. Our answer is no, we don't. And I'll show you why. Now, here's the literature, okay, that we make available. Anybody can publish that. All the original numbered tracts, miscellaneous tracts, timely greetings, volume 1 and 2, all in the original format, photographic reproductions in the answer books, the exact size and layout. This is undisputed original. And I could document it. I could show you where I got all of this stuff. I digitized it. So people can print this anywhere in the world. And so this is the thing that I was convicted back in 2004. I saw an independent ministry using this, and I was like, wait a minute. Hope International was using it. It said, here's the statement. And I believe that we should have storehouses worldwide. 7 Testimony, page 140 says, in a large degree through our publishing houses, plural, is to be accomplished the work of that other angel who comes down from heaven with great power and enlightens the earth with his glory. Now, Adventists with the judgment of the dead message don't have the message of the Revelation 18 angel. And we know what that is. That's the judgment of the living. That's the shepherd's rod. When it comes down, the 3 angels' message will be repeated with power and force. So I recognized back then, I said, wait a minute. These publishing houses are not the ones in Ellen White Day, but that's an application, but the full application has to be for ones that are published in the meat and due season, the present truth, the shepherd's rod. So this is the premise that we started UPA7.org, and that's where it stands. So we give this diagram scattering period. So, okay, Old Mount Carmel, Brother Haddoff, he goes 1930, it moves 1935, 1955, he dies. The message goes down. Florence runs it into the ground by 62, but 61, faithful Davidians reorganize at Vista. Then 70 goes to Salem, 74, Yucaipa, 86 joins with Mountaindale. Mountaindale not interested in publishing around the world and no longer publishing original like they did for almost 20 years. So UPA 7 rises out of necessity. And the arrows were just to symbolize we don't believe in a headquarters in the East Coast of the U.S. It's not necessary. We believe in publishing worldwide, everywhere, localized, in this scattering period. So the question is, how are you going to reach 22 million Seventh-day Adventists around the world? You can't do it from one location in the U.S. It's impossible. Waco says, oh, we'll print all the literature. The amount of effort it takes to ship the literature, it's astronomical expenses. We can set up publishing houses, and we've set up over a dozen now, for less than the cost to ship a box of literature to Africa. So it is very streamlined and practical. Now, I put this together in detail to show you what I call a lineage. I'm just going to summarize it. But in the green, I show a straight line, the key. Who preserved the original literature? That's the key. Different locations, okay? So it goes from the original organization, original literature, then Florence takes over. Original literature for most of the time, but I put the red around it, corrupted leadership. And then it goes to the 100% rod-only Davidians. They still kept that voting and nominating. And then you get splinters, the purple ones, 62, that's Bashan and splinters off of them. It goes to Salem, 70, Yucaipa, 74, Mount Dale, 86. Off of Mount Dale, all kinds of splinters. I put them in yellow. I call those caramel pasture, okay? The green, and then the pink ones, I don't pay much attention, but that's rodent in the branch. So this is an attempt to diagram all the different factions, okay, where they came from theologically. What do you teach and what do you publish? Now, I've left pre-11th hour has separated from Old Mount Dale on the basis primarily of the new codes, okay? And I leave a dash around there, okay, because they're still in, interaction with Mount Dale. Now, this is the last slide here. How did Davidians deal with Ezekiel 47? Now, this is a summary. And if anybody has correction, I'll accept it. Mountaindale and Salem believe in the eastward movement of the storehouse / and or headquarters, but they stop short to justify their claims. So they're very much into this eastward course. I believe that it comes primarily from a heavy emphasis from teaching from Don Adair to justify Salem, and Mount Dale co-opted it. What's interesting is other groups, International GADSDA, that is Wanda Bloom, who's passed away as well last year, her group out in California, New Waco under Norman Archer that split from Mount Dale in 1991, 11th Hour Church under Lennox Sam, they are all argue that the fountain will not be open till the kingdom. And the eastward course of the stream has nothing to do with the movement of God's storehouse. This is problematic because it denies Ellen White's quoting of Ezekiel 47. It denies Brother Houteff using it to move from Waco or from Los Angeles to Waco. So that's a real red flag here. But this is where they stand. Now, Brother Peralta, you're here. I'm just summarizing as I see it. Pre-11th hour relocates back to Texas. And now I say you're in a theological conundrum regarding the storehouse headquarters issue and I keep emphasizing can't overlook the 2005 split. Now, I'll let you clarify if there's anything I missed here, but from what I know, okay, you've got, I don't know exactly what you have out there in Texas, okay, and what you're doing for publishing, but this is at least, I'm just trying to summarize. And then finally, Bashan doesn't pay much attention to it at all. Trevor told me that. We'd never pay much attention to it. They don't even publish Shepherd's Rod Volume 2. So they don't think it has any relevance at all. So that's basically a summary. And this is one thing, last thought that's important. I picked this up. Most all Davidian groups and associations argue, not all of them, but most of them, Don Adair in principle argued this, that there must be a Davidian headquarters in the domain of the United States, or the two-horned beast. And they quote 8 Tract 24. Now, back when Mount Dale split in 2005, I said, wait a minute, is that what that tract statement says? We're going to go look at it. And I caught Don Adair misinterpreting the rod. And unfortunately, many Davidians continue to follow that. So in reality, this is where we stand now. There's no need for Davidian headquarters in the United States in the sense of executive council, a camp, and all of that. No need at all, especially in the East Coast. The call to establish semi-autonomous, self-supporting Shepherd's Rod publishing houses in locations around the world to reach 22 million Seventh-day Adventists is the most logical and prudent way to close the work for the church. The marching orders are already in the rod. The message is complete, ready to go. Let's scatter it as the leaves of autumn. So that's where we've come to. So if people say, well, where do you stand on Ezekiel 47? We're saying it was used in the past, okay, by Brother Houteff, Ellen White, and that's absolutely true, 100%. Will the fountain be open for a cleansing fountain after the house of David is set up? Absolutely. We believe that. But it's also open as a teeny rivulet starting in Ellen White's day. We believe that. As far as the emphasis of having to have a headquarters in the east coast of the U.S. that Mount Dale and Salem use, we're not going to make that argument anymore. We believe that that was amplified by Don Adair, and we don't feel comfortable saying, oh, that's a fundamental doctrine of the rod. We're going to leave it where Brother Houteff left it. After his death and after Waco, Old Mount Carmel, we believe now the most prudent thing is to set up publishing for the original around the world. So that's where we stand. I think that's it. Oh, okay. I forgot to read this. This is key because you got to confront Sister Lockmalee. If Waco brings this up, you've got to confront them. What does the tract say? 8 tract 40, page 24. Although the marking and the slaughter of Ezekiel 9 include only the church, Judah and Israel, the hurting by the winds and the hurting by the angels, Revelation 7, include all the world. Both the earth and the sea, each of which is indicative of a different locality. The sea in the realm of nature, of the nature of storehouse or home of the waters, is therefore the realm, in the realm of symbols, the birthplace of the nations, the old country, the earth. The opposite of the sea is correspondingly the domain away from the old country. It is located to John in the symbol of the two-horned beast coming up, not out of the sea, but out of the earth, Revelation 13:11, the only place where trees naturally grow. And as according to Daniel 4, verses 20 to 22, trees are figurative of rulers. Therefore, the trees in this instance represent the, quote, ancient men before the house, Ezekiel 9, verse 6, a fact which reveals that in this period, the church's headquarters are in the two-horned beast dominion, the new world, the earth. So I asked the question, which headquarters are in the domain of the two-horned beast according to the rod?
Seventh-day Adventist Church.
That's right. That's a general conference, which now is Silver Springs, Maryland. It's irrefutable. So I've asked a lot of Davidians about that because when Mount Dale split in 2005, they had telephone conference calls trying to reorganize a group. And there was a major argument, oh, it has to be in the east in Pennsylvania because of 8 tract 24. And during that call, I finally raised my hand. I said, wait a minute. I said, go read the statement. That's not what the statement says. And when I did that, nobody wanted to look at it. And I said, that's a Don Adair teaching. And it's like, Brother Peralta said, we have many lessons to learn and what? Many, many to unlearn. So, friends, we got to unlearn. We just got to go what the rod says. So our argument is if you want the headquarters, our goal is the future headquarters for the gospel is in Palestine. Let us all, brethren, do our part to strive to be one of the numbers so we can make it there and scatter the leaves of autumn. The work is right in front of us. Let's go for it. So that's our appeal. So the argument of having to have a headquarters, executive councils and politics and executive councils and all that theater that goes on with sessions, we're free. We don't need it. Groups can organize locally that know each other and gather their tithes and offerings to set up those publishing houses and finance them. And it's much simpler. So we're free from the political turmoil, if you will, of many of those factions that are trying to control the work from the U.S. And I'm like, no, God's going to scatter it. So that concludes the presentation. I'll open it up for your thoughts and comments.